honorable ministers, distinguished guests, partners, and friends, welcome to this MasterCard Foundation convening. It's all about education for girls and young women. And that's why we've titled this Powering Parity. Let me begin by thanking you and acknowledging your leadership. Thank you for being such champions of education for girls and for young women.
We know we have a tough assignment ahead of us. Over 100 million young people between the ages of 6 and 18 across Africa
are excluded from formal education. And yet, we have hope. We have hope because of you, because of your actions, your leadership, your innovations that are creating opportunities for young people in education. Now, you know that education comes right to the heart of the work of the MasterCard Foundation. Whether it's been about enabling access to education for young people, whether it's been about improving the quality of education, whether it's been about working with entrepreneurs in education to close last miles, whether it's been about building and developing institutions of education, this has been the bedrock of our work. We know that girls and young women face unique challenges, but we also know when they have access to education, when they're able to acquire knowledge and skills and learning, when they transition from school into the workforce, they make outsized contributions for their families, for their communities, and for their countries. That's why we're so excited to listen and learn from all of you today. Today, we're going to hear from governments about the innovations and the actions that they're taking. We're going to hear from our partners about the work that they are powering forward. And most importantly, we're going to hear from young women themselves about their ideas and their experiences. We have a lot to learn from you. We have a lot to learn from each other. And so for today, just strap in, be a student, be a teacher, be a learner, but most importantly, be a champion. Let's translate these lessons into action. Action that we can scale across Africa. Let's just embrace the opportunities to collaborate. For the Foundation, this is our moment to work with you, to take your work to higher scales. So I want to thank you. Thank you again for making this time, for being together, and for our partnership. I wish you a terrific session.
Perhaps we can get this conversation started. So, in reality, we can all appreciate some of the challenges when we are talking about education on the continent. There are not just the content challenges that we have, but there are also some logistical and infrastructure challenges that make it difficult for for young girls and women to learn, let alone other issues such as health-related issues and reproductive rights issues. But that's not the focus of this conversation. The issue, perhaps, if I can begin with you, Minister Nagar, in reality, when we're talking about Ethiopia, there are some specific policies and programs which you have implemented, which have changed the landscape. Can you share specifically, and perhaps I'm going to be a little bit restrictive in the sense that we don't have a huge amount of time, so instead of going through all of them, can I ask you maybe to highlight a handful, maybe 3 or 4, which you feel have been most significant in moving the needle and changing how you're able to allow girls to learn? Your microphone is right next to you.
Thank you very much. In fact, you're right that if we start going through all the reforms that we're doing in Ethiopia in education, it's going to be, it takes much longer than this 1 hour that we're splitting for 4. Probably the most important, as you said, maybe 4 areas where I need to concentrate is the starting point is the first one, that we started with a complete audit of the education system that has been taking place for the last 40 years. And what we have found, despite the fact that there are all kinds of numbers that tell us that we're doing fantastic in many areas, that the education system has more or less collapsed. It has collapsed in very serious ways. The first one, so it's based on that analysis that we said, okay, what are we going to do to fix them? But before we fix them, can we identify exactly where the key problems are? And a good number of the problems were not what the international education crowd is saying where the problem is. The first one that we have identified is that the integrity of the education system fundamentally has collapsed, which essentially means that the numbers that we're getting in terms of how we're doing in education is not true. It is highly politically driven, and therefore, if we want to do something really serious and something seriously honest, the first thing that we need to do is we have to maintain the integrity of the data and know exactly what actually is going on. So the first thing that we have done is, through this audit, we have found out that the numbers that we're getting about the number of students, the numbers that we're getting about the number of students that have passed national exams, the various indicators of how our education system works is essentially not based on the truth. They are mostly made-up numbers to make governments look good. And therefore, if we really are going to do something serious, then we have to be absolutely clear that we know the exact numbers, what actually is going on in the education system. One example of this, and I'm going to do this very quickly, was looking at the number of students that were passing the national exam in high school. We call it the Ethiopian School Leaving Certificate Exam. So before I came to the ministry, we were getting numbers like 60%, 70% passing these exams. But almost everybody in the country knows that those numbers are incorrect in a number of ways, but the most important one being the exams themselves are stolen because of competition between regions, and therefore students are not really tested whether they know what they ought to know at that level. So we changed the way we give the exam. And what we did is we took all the students back to the universities to take the exam, independent of all their teachers and the regions and things of that sort. And in the first test, we got a 3.2% pass rate from 70.
Did you say 3.2?
3.2%, which was the first really wake-up call to the whole nation to say, look, all these numbers that we're talking about are not true. Then the first thing that we have to do is to actually change the moral imperative, the basic element that we need. If education is to mean something, then it has to be based on truth. If that is what the truth is, then that gives us the chance to actually improve the whole system. So the first thing that has changed the whole landscape in Ethiopian education is this process. This is now the third year that we have been giving the exam in that way. And after 3 years, the numbers start to inch up. Now this year, we are 5.2%, which we thought was a fantastic development, but we know it's going to take a generation before we improve it, so we'll do that. So the minute you know that, then what you say is, okay, so our education system is shot. What are the kinds of things that we do? And what are the reasons why? The first reason that we have identified is because of this increased pressure to expand access to education. There is this massive expansion of education without actually the necessary implements to provide quality education to students. So, we have increased the number of schools, we have increased the number of teachers, but the quality of teachers, the quality of the infrastructure of schools, everything was going down significantly. So what we said is, okay, so if we are going to despite the fact that we are absolutely certain and we are committed to increasing access as much as we can, especially concentrating on those that haven't been getting, even by Ethiopian comparison, significantly good access, like in pastoralist areas and things of that sort. While we do that, the first thing that we have to do is to increase the quality of education, so that for education to mean, even in terms of access, if you are providing access to education, then it has to be access to quality education, not just to simply go through the motions of education, because then it is going to come and bite you, as it did in our case in the 12th grade students. So quality improvement becomes the most important thing that we're going to do.
I'm going to ask you, I'm going to hurry up a little bit.
Sure.
I'm going to ask you for one more intervention that you did, because I want to make sure that we have opportunity to follow
Absolutely.
up as well.
So when it comes to quality, we identified teacher education, improvement in the infrastructure of schools, improvement in the availability of school educational materials to students. All these are areas of interventions that we have defined. If we have some time, later we'll talk about what we are going to do about these issues in order to improve the quality of education.
It's really interesting that you literally are describing having to start from base, that you literally having to rebuild the education system. And that takes time, right? Because you have to start from first grade and even kindergarten and work your way all the way through to 12th grade. Minister, if I can then come to you, what is it that you have been able to do in Sierra Leone, which not only is changing the system, but that is bringing fresh and innovative thinking to how you are doing education in your country?
Thank you very much. And I'll first like to start off by thanking the organizers for inviting me to share the experience from Sierra Leone, but also learn from others who are championing education parity across the continent. So quickly, also the context of in Sierra Leone, in terms of the Ministry of Education, we have two ministries of education, one for basic and senior secondary education, and we have the Ministry of Technical and Higher Education, where I'm currently serving as the minister. And the government has always placed an emphasis on education. During the first term, from 2018 to 2023, education was the flagship program, and that saw heavy investment into the free quality school education program that removed the financial barrier in accessing education at basic and senior secondary education. So my ministry, the Ministry of Technical and Higher Education, we have to protect that investment that has already been made into basic and senior secondary education. We have to ensure that our young people, and bear in mind that Sierra Leone has a very youthful population, our young people are given the enabling environments to thrive, where they can acquire the skills that they need now, 21st century skills, that would also be translated into socioeconomic development and youth employment, which is another priority for the government over the next 4 years. So the focus that we have within the ministry is to ensure that we position our young people to support socioeconomic development, and we do so using innovative approaches to enable equitable access, but equitable access to quality education. And everything that we do it through the gender equality, social justice, and inclusivity lens. And there's a reason for that. In 2022, the government, under the leadership of His Excellency, mandated that there should be minimum 30% female representation in leadership positions. And this is the Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Act. And we have to ensure that we don't play lip service to that. We have to ensure that we're proactive in ensuring that that policy is something that is set in stone. So with regards to expanding equitable access, my ministry deals with vocational training and we deal with universities. The first thing we need to do is ensure that there is representation at a regional level and district level in terms of accessing education. And we have to also think about using innovative ways of doing so. I'll give you an example. So when I assumed office last year, 249,000 young people took the entrance exams to university. Of 249,000, 137,000 met the minimum requirement for university. Sierra Leone has 6 public universities and 6 private universities. And combined, they were not able to absorb up to 30,000 of that number. So what that means is that I have 100,000 young people waiting in the pipeline for the next admission cycle into university. When I talk to the Minister of Basic and Senior Secondary Education and I ask how many students are taking the entrance exam this year, he's telling me 170,000. So if you were to assume that half of them pass, then the system will always be clogged. So we have to think of innovative ways. If we cannot expand on physical infrastructure, then we have to think of innovative ways of investing in open distance learning, ODL. And then I also mentioned about the physical infrastructure where with support from partners, we're developing, we're building or rehabilitating specifically government technical institutes for vocational training. Another innovative idea that we have is with regards to vocational training. Unfortunately, there's a general misconception, as with in other parts of the world, that vocational training is for dropouts. And the reason for that, I believe, is because when the Ministry of Education was won before 2018, vocational training was embedded. It was buried. It was not brought to the forefront. So now that we have a separate ministry looking at technical and higher education, it has been brought to the forefront. So we have the task now to ensure that we change the perception, the quality and the relevance of education, not just for vocational training, but also for higher education. And an innovative idea that we're using for the relevance is ensuring that we're training in a demand-led manner. What do I mean by that? We recently received support from the World Bank to undertake a labor market survey. It was not comprehensive. We did not have unlimited resources. So what we did within the ministry was to go back to our National Development Plan and identify sectors that are linked to our National Development Plan, and we've called these the growth sectors. And we've engaged with industry players, both in the public and the private space, and asked them, what are the skills you'd like to see in young people when they graduate? We're going to use the output of that exercise to circle back and do curriculum review and ensure that we're training in a demand-led manner, but also foster soft skills to complement the technical side of things. What do I mean by soft skills? Leadership, entrepreneurship, digital literacy, financial literacy. But the labor market survey has also allowed us to partner with industry players because now they see themselves as stakeholders in training young people. We cannot afford to work in silos. And in doing so, we can be able to implement a policy that we have within the ministry called the dual apprenticeship policy, which is designed, just as it says on the tin, to ensure that young people are able to acquire hands-on skills, hands-on training in a real-life context as part of their training, which will go a long way in increasing their chances of employability, which would support the youth employment scheme that the government has placed a priority to. So public-private partnership. And then for universities, I served within a university in Sierra Leone for 10 years before I was appointed to serve as the Minister of Technical and Higher Education, and I was involved in multidisciplinary research. So some people might say I have a bias towards that, but that's not the case. Research is something that universities should be at the forefront, and they should be seen as supporting the government's development plan. So what we aim to do as a ministry is help the universities to position themselves to ensure that they are at the decision-making table and supporting government in providing the much-needed evidence that we need to be translated into policy and practice, support policymakers to know where interventions are needed, and that involves working across the board, working with the different ministries and asking them, what are the contemporary issues that you're grappling with now? And then we use that to collate that by sector, share with the relevant universities and mandate them that when students get to their final year, and they have to do a research project before they graduate, they should be able to design a research question from this database that we have captured. When young faculty members are looking for research grants, that should be a condition that they should be able to address these questions that the country is grappling with at the national level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Pelusine, if I can then come to you. We've seen, if one looks across the continent, we are seeing a number of countries who are trying to address this question of education, in particular education for girls and young women. What is it that that you are seeing that is contributing to that desire? Now, I can assume that some of it has to do with the outcomes from educating and the scientific research that indicates when you educate young girls and women, there's a benefit to business and society and so on. But surely there must be an additional underlying reason that is driving that change. What is that?
Thank you for your invitation. First, let me also express my gratitude for the invitation and the commitment of the foundation towards this inclusive education for a sustainable future. And we as African Union, we welcome such initiative as it contributes also to the implementation of our AU theme of the year, which is on education. So it is really very timely for us. So coming back to your question, I would say, and you alluded to it, I would say that first and foremost, charity begins at home. I believe that the most potent factor for girls' education is girls' education. It's like a snowball, and we heard it this morning. It's like a snowball process whereby those who reach high level of awareness and skills through education become the leading force of change in the society as role models, as activists, as social agents of change. Having said that, I also believe that primary requirements are the need to ensure peace and human security. Because we all know that when conflicts break out and when basic components of human security, like nutrition, like shelter, like access to water, and it was mentioned this morning, to name but a few, are afforded, the first groups to undergo discrimination and marginalization are girls and women, disabled people as well. And the education sector, as the health sector, are the ones who suffer more or most from unstable situations. Now just close your eyes 1 second and think of the number of countries with unstable situation in our continent. This means that debt burden, poverty, conflicts, humanitarian emergencies, particularly those related to the impact of climate change or widespread epidemics or pandemic, are at the epicenter of the learning deficit and lack of parity, particularly in Africa, but this applies for the whole world. Now, to narrow in on education, though over the past years there have been applaudable progress in ensuring access, retention, and completion of schooling by all in the continent, Africa still remains the only continent where gender parity has not been achieved in any level of education, with an estimated 32.6 million girls of both primary and lower secondary school age being out of school, and amongst them 9.3 million likely to never set foot in a classroom. So if you add to this that 35% of the girls are married before the age of 18, according to UNICEF, which directly undermines efforts to ensure education equity, inclusion, and parity, and I let alone the issue of STEAM education, whereby less than 30% of women graduate in STEM fields in Africa, which is a missed opportunity in having women and girls to be equipped for the 21st century's skills and be ready for the changing world of work towards a sustainable future. So I didn't speak much about our programs as African Union Commission, but you can imagine that African Union Commission doesn't have a territory. So we are not directly the implementers like my brother and my sister here, but we play a role in formulating policies, in harmonizing policies, in advocating, and in showcase of good practices to create an emulation and duplication of good practices by different countries.
So to what extent then would the African Union be able to ensure that what learnings are being garnered, whether you're looking at rebuilding an education system as they're doing in Sierra Leone, or adjusting and adapting in Ethiopia, or adjusting and adapting the education system in Sierra Leone for a different kind of future. There needs to be some kind of access and universality in ensuring that what one is doing can be replicated elsewhere. Not only is there a role for the AU in that, but to what extent is the AU ensuring that there is kind of a cross-pollination of processes so we're not continually having to reinvent the wheel?
Yeah, thank you. So first we have strategic documents, we have policies and documents that could inspire countries. And as you know, as we heard it here, and as we know that there are other examples, you know, the level of development is very different from one country to the other. And the level of access to school, access to the basic human security aspects that I have mentioned before are different from one country to the other. So there is no one size fits all. But to narrow in again once more only on girls' education and parity, because that's the topic of our discussion today, I want to tell you that to ensure parity and especially push for progress towards sustainable future, we work closely with member states for implementation of harmonized gender-sensitive policies. And in this regard, we have an international center, CFA, Centre International pour l'Éducation des Femmes et des Filles, en Afrique, in Ouagadougou. It's a technical and specialized office under my department. It is mandated to champion girls' and women's education. And the center focuses its work on promoting gender-responsive policies, teacher development, and curriculum reforms. Skills development for girls and education in humanitarian settings as well. And with regard to the education in humanitarian settings, since 2020, this center, AUCFA, launched a campaign which we call the Africa Educates Her campaign. And through this campaign, we made, and we continue to make, a call to member states and other actors like the civil society to ensure that girls return to school and remain in school and complete learning. This was done immediately in the aftermath of COVID-19, whereby, again, the disruption of school attendance has impacted girls more than boys. So we also strengthen our collaboration with member states through appointed focal points in ministries responsible for education and gender. They are trained and engaged in data collection and analysis, and we insist on disaggregated data to make sure that we have exactly the picture, because we have global data in countries when it is available, because it's not available everywhere. But we rarely find really disaggregated data which show the gap between girls and boys.
I think what's really interesting about that is the fact that you're effectively creating this repository of information, so that even though we appreciate that the challenges faced by nations are going to be dissimilar, some of the solutions can be learned from you and perhaps tweaked in a way. So if I can then come back to you, Minister, if we're talking about tweaking and reshaping, to what extent are you thinking differently about the girl question as you rebuild the system? Because there are some nuances required, not just in the context of what has happened historically, but the fact that we recognize that if we bring in the reproductive health question, that there are considerations and allowances that have to be made to ensure that girls aren't missing a week out of every month of school, for example.
You're absolutely right in that there are nuances in it, and I think most of these cross-sectional studies about the problems of education based on comparison of different countries is mostly not correct, in my view. We have to be very careful in terms of how we evaluate individual countries' data. I mean, if I give you an example, in Ethiopia, the parity in terms of the number of girls and boys attending schools is increasingly in favor of girls towards high school. For example, at the pre-K level, it's 48% and 52%. 52% boys, 48% girls. And elementary school, roughly that number stays. And at secondary level, the two are 50-50, roughly. And in fact, when you look at the achievement rate in terms of these new exams that were given, you'd see that there is still 1 or 2% difference in favor of the male students.
Can I just ask you, before you continue, and just for context, that drop-off or that change in number, what is driving that? Is that driven by the fact that we're seeing more boys not necessarily staying, so you're seeing, and therefore, commensurate increase in girls staying in school, or what is behind that?
That is mostly the case, but also what the professor mentioned in terms of conflicts and things of that sort. In this case, more boys are going into the conflict areas, and because of
so
that,
that's another dimension for you then to try to tackle.
different dimension. But you know, one of the myths that's completely broken is this assumption that men are somehow a little bit more smarter than women. I mean, which is the test scores are now showing that difference does not really exist. Actually, I mean, in this year's exam in Ethiopia, which is now the hardest exam in terms of the matriculation, the two highest grades were achieved by girls rather than boys in the whole country. In the whole country, and this is
the girls knew that. We knew that.
Yeah. No, so the idea. So when you talk about education in the Ethiopian context, that's why I say rather than going from the general, we start from the particular, the Ethiopian context. The problem we have is not in the numbers in terms of girls going into schools. They are going to schools at a higher level, although there are differences in geographic areas, less in pastoralist areas and others. Therefore, we have to focus in pastoralist areas to make sure that girls in pastoralist areas are joining. The key is when the overall quality of education goes down, then those that are capable start to suffer because they are not. So what we need to do is to make sure that the overall quality of education, starting from the lower grades, is improved. Let me just say one important issue, at least in the way we addressed it. The infrastructure of schools was one of the big impediments to quality education. And we have something like 60,000 schools. So when we look at the appropriateness of the schools to attract, for example, girls in terms of wash facilities and things of that sort, we see that there is a serious problem. And we started a campaign to improve schools, not from donors, not from the state, because the state does not have, it is strapped by all kinds of fiscal concerns. So we started mobilizing the community to improve the schools, to make it attractive to students. In 1 year, the public, this is the community and former students, raised roughly about 30 billion birr, which is about $500 million, to improve the facilities of close to 17,000 schools in 1 year. This is now leading towards more and more commitment by the community that the question of education is not just about the state, it's about the whole community. In the past, by pushing private sector education, one of the things that we did was we weakened the state's ability to provide decent education, particularly to the poor. We created inequality in education, which is one of the most dangerous things that we can do to create a stable society. And we said, in fact, more than these other criteria, which are important, making sure that the poor would get as good an education as the rich by eliminating the inequalities in education on the basis of class, on the basis of financial income. That is probably the most important thing that we can do. And that's why we're trying to push more and more students to go to the public schools. In the past, the rich and the government officials, they send their kids into private schools and they don't give a damn about the public schools. Now we're saying, no. This is not sustainable. For society to be stable, the most important inequality that we cannot afford is inequality in education, and that we have to invest as a society for the poor to get at least a decent education so that they can compete in society. That issue is what is forgotten by the international community. We assume simply privatizing education is going to improve the situation. That's not what actually is driving the problems that we are having in
Minister,
education.
I'm sorry to interrupt you again. I'm just being mindful of the time. We only have 5 minutes left. That's a really interesting comment that you made around the question of communities and ownership of education, right? Which is what you're trying to foster. Madam Minister, if I can then come to you. Ownership transcends a number of sectors and spaces, right? So there is the personal ownership of one's education. There is the communal ownership of one's education. So our communities keeping schools safe. So for example, in South Africa, vandalism in community schools was a problem. How do you make sure that the communities say, we will not accept this happening in our neighborhood? If you want to do this, you're going to have to find somewhere else to do it. So there's that communal ownership. But then there's also the question of the public-private partnership, which is what you mentioned in your previous remarks. And the notion of how do we ensure that the collectivity of ownership means that not only are we encouraging and creating an environment that can absorb your 150,000 learners who are languishing, whether it be by online education or remote access or whichever you want to call it, but that there is also an understanding from the public-private partnership perspective that when you're absorbing and working, that you're creating environments that are conducive to absorbing learners who are ready for today and the future. How is Sierra Leone tackling that preparedness of learners that you're producing?
Thank you very much. So ultimately, national ownership for us involves working concertedly with all the relevant stakeholders at all levels, including students. We are known to bring students to the decision-making tables because without students, there's no ministry for me to run. And national ownership also means national investment. And as much as we value partnerships that and support we have from development partners and other organizations, there should be that sense of national investment. What you invest in, you protect. And for that, we've started a technical and higher education fund, where historically, within the education space in Sierra Leone, there's a heavy dependence on these institutions, on the government to give them funding. Yes, the government invests 22% of its national budgets to education, but there should be a sense of the institutions also being able to think innovatively as to how they can drive the much needed transformation that is needed, that would also create the platform for gender parity that we're talking about. And the Technical and Higher Education Fund, it's something that will be sustainable and innovative. And as a ministry, we're looking at that as a way in which we can diversify the income streams, but also link it to quality. What do I mean by that? We all know about performance-based financing. It's tried and tested in other parts of the world. It's tried and tested within the health sector in Sierra Leone. What are the lessons learned from that we can apply to the education space in Sierra Leone? And the thinking that we have within the ministry is that we come up with performance indicators linked to our national development plan, linked to Agenda 2063 from the African Union, linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, and we get our universities to work towards improving these quality indicators. How you perform will determine how much money you're able to access from that Technical and Higher Education Fund. And we're also working with other partners, UNECA, the Times Higher Education, to come up with an education management system and a quality management system that will help the universities to know what needs to be done to generate this data that we can then use to inform policies, that can be used to develop these gender-sensitive policies, inclusive policies, but also interventions. And I'll go back to the point that I made earlier about accessing education. So I mentioned that there's been heavy investment into quality, into secondary and basic education. We have to ensure that we protect that investment. And as a ministry, what we're doing is that we're introducing a granting aid scheme, so a local scholarship, specifically for female students in the STEAM field, so science, technology, engineering, agriculture, which we've added because it's our flagship program, and mathematics. And the reason for that is because, as we can all agree, these are sectors that are historically dominated by men. But if you want to generate the future leaders of tomorrow and we want women to thrive within those spaces, we start today by ensuring that we provide them access to education, and then it should be quality education as well. Thank you.
There is literally never going to be enough time to talk about this, ever, ever, ever. But I think what's really exciting for me is this question of deliberately challenging yourselves as to how do we solve these problems, which in many instances have become quite intransigent. So I applaud you for that, but I also wish you bon chance, because I think the tremendous challenge is certainly not for the faint of heart. So, Minister Wari, Minister Nagar, Professor Belosine, we have to leave it there because we are literally out of time, as you can tell. Thank you so very much for sharing your insights and for giving us some inspiration as to how we can begin thinking differently about girls' education. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for what you are all doing. Tina, let me start with you. And, we mentioned right at the start where the foundation is positioned in terms of supporting education in the world. But let's dive deeper into that, particularly when it comes to powering parity. What is the work you are doing? What is it that you're learning? What are the outcomes you're achieving? But what's the challenge also moving forward? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie, for that. Before I get into the answer, I want to just talk about my experience, especially in this type of work. Women, parity, empowerment. My mind goes back to 1995. I don't know who was there and how old people were, to the Beijing conference. The Beijing conference brought together women from all countries in the world, if I remember correctly, to talk about issues affecting women. I've spent most of my career in the private sector and realize now the problem with that. I felt removed from this subject, and it is so personal to everybody. Lofty goals, a lot of work, a lot of hard work went in after the Beijing conference. And yet, 2024, we're still talking about 51 million young women, not in school, not in work, not in skills training. And we've heard enough about the statistics, we've heard enough about the barriers to them. But in the eyes of the young girl who is in deep rural Zimbabwe, where I come from, she's not thinking what the hard work has been. She's thinking, they let me down. And so as we think about her, someone said to us last week in a totally different context, but equally relevant, I don't want to be resilient. I want to thrive. If that were to be, and it is, I know, but we talk and we do so much. How are we not getting to the crux of breakthrough for this? How does she stop toiling every single day just to make it work? And actually wakes up every single moment thriving about something. Our children are best able to thrive, but it's a right for every child. I digress a little bit because I'm also extremely proud of the work that the foundation does. I think first of all, we recognize the role of education in simply being the bedrock for socioeconomic development of any country. At so many levels. A child that goes through 12 years of education, this is well known, is developed for good citizenry. Their options become a lot more. Then as they go to tertiary education, we know that's how we can convert, a lot of the the socioeconomic advancements into value addition. This is how we know the system works. So all levels of education are extremely important. The foundation programs at several levels within education, secondary school, where we look both at girls' education. My colleague Hajra is here, who looks after that space. We also look at the educator side, because equally important is what they do. Then our work in tertiary education focuses on our scholars program, which is more than just a scholarship. It is about developing transformative leaders, and we know how much that is needed on the continent. We also then focus on bringing together collaboratives of educational institutions that are focusing on particular problems in Africa and how to solve those problems, including how can our institutions become better at what they do. And then, the space that the minister in Nigeria was talking about, and that is the role of technology in education. No matter what we think, we are not going to get those 51 million young women, plus an additional number to make up the 109 that are not in school or employment, back into school. They also deserve a chance to complete their education wherever they dropped off. And then, of course, the very important area of, so how do we prepare young people to get into work? And whose role is it? I think this is not the time to be apportioning blame or responsibility. It's all hands on deck. So this is what we do. And this is where we're seeing significant, amounts of impact, not only at the individual level, but also how institutions are starting to change. And then how do those institutions, right, start to also influence the ecosystem in which they work? I'm on stage today. Thank you so much for being so generous. But the true heroes, the women that are moving mountains to make it work, are the ones that are with me here. So please, another round of applause. I got to know the work of Comfort, which has become a core partner of the foundation for the last 13 years, right? Working with us to, in a way that has become unique to a few institutions that I'm aware of, the ability to reach the young girl in deep rural communities, changing the fortunes of those young people, right? And it has been an absolute pleasure of ours as we reach, the numbers that we have reached together. The next partner is our partner Fawe, led by Mother, who is just an inspiration as well. Fiona is too. And I think of all the remarkable things, the 10,000, more than 10,000 that we've been able to reach. One of the remarkable outcomes of how our partners who are so key to what we do are able to influence at policy level is the program in Uganda, which Martha will be able to talk about. That paved the way for a young child who drops out of education for whatever reason to be able to rejoin, and for that process to be recognized by the government. I think that the podium really belongs to Fiona and to Martha. And so, Julie, I'll give them space to speak.
Wow, let's give that a round of applause. What remarks, just very powerful. And I do come to these incredible women now. Let me start with you, Martha. And, it's been a journey of over a decade, I believe, of work between the foundation, the MasterCard Foundation, and FAWE. Talk us through, when we talk about embracing bold action, the bold things FAWE has been doing. the things that are working and how can we do better collaboratively. I think the term was, all hands on deck. There's so much to do. What have you learned about how we can do better collaboratively? What kind of partnerships do we need to continue building moving forward to connect access to education, but also outcomes, connection to livelihoods? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. We talked about FAWE, but it is the Forum for African Women Educationalists. And we have been in existence for the last 31 years. And when Tina was saying, oh, this has gone on, but in 2024, we are still talking about the same. But I want to say that much as the challenges still do exist, a lot has gone in, a lot has changed. Lives have been touched, and the future is bright. We only need to do more. Come together, all of us. I want to go back to the work that we have done. For the past 31 years, FAWE has been innovative in terms of what works in promotion of women and girls' education, what needs to be done, and what needs to be done differently. The past 10 years, the foundation came together to put effort with FAWE, to further build on the works that FAWE had done for the years. But again, I want to mention that you'll do one thing for 10 years, but when you sit down to reflect, you realize you can do it better. And that's what I want to talk about. That for the past 10 years, we've mentioned about the number of girls that is out of school. There are plenty. And many of them, it's for various reasons. But the most critical is pregnancy and unwanted and forced marriages. That is number one explanation for the number of girls that drop out of school, the millions that we are talking about today. But as we got into partnership with the foundation, we had to explore what we had done for 30 years, but also reflect in a co-creation manner to come up with a program that would change lives, that would add value, that would create impact. And I think at FAWE, when we are discussing, those are some of the things that we reflect on, and every day we say thank you to the foundation.
Fiona, let me come to you next. And what's so exciting about seeing Fiona on the stage is that she was part of CAMFED. She's one of the very students that has gone through, and look where she sits today as a leader, enabling so many others. It's such a powerful story. Your learnings, the work that you're doing, the impact you're having, what is it that we need to know as we move forward to power even more parity?
Like our colleagues at FAWE, this is the 31st year of CAMFED partnering with governments and communities to achieve gender parity in education, ensuring that girls from the most marginalized, poor families in rural Africa can secure that right to education and that right to dignity that they deserve. You mentioned that I came through the pipeline of CAMFED support. And sometimes I find myself and pinching myself, am I really sitting here? Am I really talking to people? Because the life of, if you had told me that the young girl that I was, growing up in rural Zimbabwe, under the care of my maternal grandmother, would transform to be the woman that I am now, and because of education, I would not have believed you. You see, perhaps maybe just to give you context, I'm the firstborn to parents who never completed primary school. My mother only did 2 years of primary education, and my father only 5 years of primary education, and that meant that they were confined to a life of subsistence farming. And they struggled. They really wanted me to be able to attain an education, but they could not just because they were poor. And I remember working very hard, working my way through primary and secondary education, and always feeling like I could lose the grasp on education because I was born in poverty. But Comfort came on, supported me, made sure that I completed high school, go all the way to university and become first generation graduate for my family and my community.
That's amazing.
Thank you, everybody, that has shared thoughts as we really gear towards this moment, which gives us immense pride. We've heard the wonderful testimonies from our dear partners, Comfort and Fawe. Mother and Fiona, thank you so much for championing this work. It is not easy work, as we know, but you do it. And so, as the foundation, given our long history of working together, 13 years, almost, it gives us immense pleasure to renew this relationship, to renew these partnerships. And as we prepared on how that would look, we have renewed the partnerships with 7 years, for another 7 years, with each of the organizations. And together, we will reach more than 70,000 young women and girls who face the most significant financial and social burdens, standing in the way of them completing education and reaching livelihoods that are meaningful. So thank you so much. And as we support these young women together, young women and girls together, the foundation is adding an additional $360 million investment over the 7 years. And the impact of these initiatives, while directly reaching more than 70,000 young women and girls, will actually touch over 3.3 million young women and men in the course of the work that will happen. Through this, we are incredibly proud to continue to deepen our relationships with both Fawe and Comfort, learning together and creating even more meaningful impact at individual level, within the institutions that we are going to be touching, and the policies and practices that we will be able to influence in this process. Thank you so much.